All right, what's up, everybody? Miss Lynch here. This is Chapter 5, Part 2. Okay, let's get into it. All right. Somebody's speaking very loudly in the next room. Hopefully that doesn't pick up for you guys. All right, so where were we last time? The last thing we had talked about was the intolerable acts. So our coercive acts or intolerable acts, golly, it's hard to say, was a new series of taxes being imposed on the colonists. And the last thing we had talked about was the Quebec Act, which let British colonists move in and puts our territorial boundaries between the French and British territories into question. Ohio's a big point of contention, and the colonists, a lot of people feel like British Parliament did this because they were trying to strengthen Catholicism. Okay, so that's where we were. Okay. Which leads us to, we had talked about the Stamp Act Congress before, which is the first real organization of the colonies altogether acting against Britain. All right, so this is kind of the next step of that. Okay, opposition to the intolerable acts spread to small towns and rural areas, spreading resistance, which, going back to, well, I don't know if you heard that, the printing press being this technological advancement of the time that allowed people to spread their message and thoughts and ideologies. This plays into this growing revolutionary thought, okay? All right, so a convention of delegates from Massachusetts, different towns approved a series of resolutions, so it become the Suffolk Resolves, and these urged Americans to refuse obedience to those new acts that were being imposed on them, and to not pay their taxes, and to prepare for war, because they had a feeling that the powers that be would retaliate, and they do, so they were correct in that capacity. Okay, so to coordinate resistance to the intolerable acts, a Continental Congress was put together, okay? This group met in Philadelphia in September and October of 1774. 12 of our 13 colonies were represented, everybody but Georgia, all right? They endorsed the Suffolk Resolves, so that protesting of British power. Okay, endorsed the Suffolk Resolves. They adopted the Continental Association, so this is our first real alliance of the colonies as one entity. They called for a halt of British trade, and then there is our second Continental Congress will meet in May of 1775. A different tone to that meeting, but so this is our first Continental Congress, okay? Okay. So this brings us up to April of 1775, April 19th. So British soldiers marched from Boston to Concord in Massachusetts, as still, okay, seeking to seize arms, so weaponry that had been stockpiled there in Concord. All right. Colonial writers are sent out to warn people about this march. This is where Paul Revere comes into the picture, okay? Would not have been saying the British are coming, because at this point, everyone involved in this is British, so whenever you hear that, that is incorrect, okay? Could have been saying the Redcoats are coming, because that would have represented the military itself, but as far as the British are coming, that never happened, okay? All right, so writers are sent out. They are able to warn local leaders and militiamen, who then take up arms, try to resist. And then there are different little skirmishes that occur that are referred to as battles. And the first two are at Lexington and Concord, okay? Concord, depending on how you want to say it, but anyway, so those are our first two battles of the Revolution, all right? After Lexington and Concord, the British retreat back to Boston. And so during those two altercations, 49 colonists and 73 Royal Army soldiers died, okay? The next main battles of the Revolution are Ticonderoga and then at Bunker Hill, which were both early American victories, which then forces the British to retreat even more. So they are, well, actually, I guess they're going south, retreating back to New York City, okay? Okie dokie. So this takes us to our Second Continental Congress. So their kind of main aim, the First Continental Congress was just for, acknowledgement, essentially. The Second Continental Congress is establishing an army, all right? They printed money to pay for it. We talked about printed money before and how it was considered worthless to British Parliament. So the colonists now start printing money for themselves that is recognized as American money, okay? And then George Washington was appointed as commander. He's already a reputable military leader, thinking back to the 7 Years' War, where he was a young commanding officer that fired that first shot. Okay, so can't remember exactly how old he is at this point, but so reputable commander becomes our first commander-in-chief, all right? So all this is happening, Britain then declared the colonies to be in a state of rebellion, and they start sending thousands of troops over, all right? They also ordered the closing of all colonial ports. Again, thinking, Boston, Philadelphia, New York, and then going further south, but anywho. Okay, so this goes back to what I had said before. Many colonists shied away from the idea of independence. This makes sense. At this point, Britain is the main global power, so removing yourself from that protection was something that was very scary to the colonists. So most people did not want this rebellion. They just wanted everything to go back to the way it was. They were cool with paying taxes if everything would just calm down, but we'll see what happens, okay? We know that that is not the case. They shied away from this idea of independence. There was pride in being part of the British Empire, and they feared that breaking with the mother country would unleash further conflict, which it did. Okay, November 1775, there is in Virginia what is known as Lord Dunmore's Proclamation. So Lord Dunmore is our British governor and military commander, and he offered freedom to any slave who escaped and joined the British, okay? Approximately 800 people would do that in Virginia under Lord Dunmore's proclamation. And the main positions that those people would take in fighting for the British would be jobs as spies, guides, cooks, laundresses, or launderers, I guess you could say, and then also construction positions. Okay, so that will be a force that the British acquire early on. Okay, so going back to the printing press. In January of 1776, there's a pamphlet written by Thomas Paine that comes out talking about American independence, and it is called Common Sense. All right, so that's why this is italicized. It's just the title of the pamphlet. Because of our printing press, Common Sense is able to be widely circulated, and it became one of the most successful and influential pamphlets in the history of political writing, which still stands today, that statement, okay? It avoided complex language and Latin phrases that were common in pamphlets at the time that were aimed at educated readers. Common Sense was just that, it was common sense. It was supposed to be for common people, for, the rest of us, all right? But so this is able to spread through the colonies, spread that revolutionary ideology, gain support for the American aim. All right. Okay. So this takes us to a Declaration of Independence. Okay. So July 2nd, 1776. Our Second Continental Congress is still meeting, and they declared that, boom, the United States, an independent nation, no longer part of the British Empire. Okay, so, July 2nd. So over the next 2 days, they are working on finalizing this document that then is approved on July 4th, and this is what we know as the Declaration of Independence. Okay. It was primarily written by Thomas Jefferson, revised by the Congress. And if you all, which I'm sure everyone's just going to jump for joy to do this, but if you guys look at your appendix in the back of your book, there is the full text of the Declaration of Independence. I don't know if I put that on the syllabus, but I would consider this an extra credit reading if you read through the Declaration and gave me a paragraph reflection on what it's saying and why it's important. Obviously, there's the basic reason why it's important. It's the creation of our country, and it's anyway, I will leave that to you guys. If you want to consider this an extra credit thing, read it. Tell me why it's important to you. Okay. All right. Okay, so our declaration, it is a list of grievances against King George, the good King George, and it ranged from, like I said before, the conversation of quartering troops, because that was imposed on common people, that British troops could live with you and use all of your resources, and they were protected in doing so. But so this declaration speaks out against all sorts of things ranging from quartering troops to imposing taxes without consent, which I said is our big rallying cry for the revolution. And then also the Declaration, it justified a breach with Britain and their assertion of the right of revolution. Okay. All right, there's a shift from the rights of Englishmen to the rights of mankind as the object of American independence, which we know at this point in time is not solely true and will take generations of work to get us to where we are today. But there's the shift from, the shift to the idea of a universal rights, okay? The prior generation that I had mentioned said life, liberty, property were their main, the main goals of one's freedom. And I said that would change as we get closer to the revolution. So here we are, okay? So life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness become our main objectives, all right? So not just those who can own property, but your pursuit of happiness and whatever that means to you, okay? So yeah, it's open-ended. Open-ended statement, and introduces the democratic process where individuals could develop their own potential and shape society as they saw fit. Okay. Yeah, so pursuit of happiness, that this just ties into more of that, but it's the concept of individual self-fulfillment, unimpeded by the government, and this whole movement pushes for the end of the monarchy, aristocracy, and hereditary privilege, which we, going back a little bit, I'd said that, particularly in the South, but offices in the colonies were beginning to be passed down to generations, okay? So this hereditary privilege, that's what that is speaking out against. All right, there is the creation of this concept of American exceptionalism, which we still talk about today. Anytime we get involved in a military conflict, American exceptionalism can always kind of tie into that. But this was the belief that America, the United States, has a special mission to end tyranny across the world, and that America is the symbol of freedom and a model for other societies, all right? A central theme in American nationalism, and like I said, ongoing still, but any old who, I won't get into that too much. Okay, moving right along, securing independence. All right, so declaring independence is one thing, winning it was another, which, because there's an entire war that breaks out because of this. We know that Britain was the greatest military on earth. I've been kind of reiterating that a few times. And when all this happens, they viewed the Americans as traitors, and they vowed to crush their rebellion, all right? Early on, the balance of power was in Britain's favor. Like I said, they're the top power in the world. They have the biggest army. They're the most well-trained. They also had German soldiers that were helping. So these were our Hessians or Hessians. The Hessians had a powerful navy, very experienced military commanders. So everyone really didn't think that this would go on very long, that the colonists wouldn't be able to hold their own. Americans, for this reason, right here. So they were reliant on local militias. So all of our communities, it was whoever can fight can get together. And they were inadequately equipped, all right? But our local militias, they fight, and then we have our Continental Army that will develop over time. Like I said, they just established the concept of creating an army. So we'll kind of get to that. Colonists were not well equipped going into this, all right? But the concept that they were fighting on their own soil caused, this inspired devotion and sacrifice, which will be a common theme for us. Okay. Between 1775, so early on, through the whole conflict, 1775 to 1783, some 200,000 men would bear arms in the Continental Army, which was voluntary, or in their local militias. Like I said, anybody who, able-bodied, so to speak. Sorry, I actually don't like that term, and I don't like that I left that in there. But, so our local militias were required, anybody who could fight would be required to do so, unless you had a substitute, which is common for individuals that have resources to do so. Not just in this war, you can see that in other points of time, kind of across the board. Pay somebody to go fight for you. Okay, anywho. All right, I'm looking at our next slide. So in the colonies, the free European male population between ages 16 and 45, 1 in 20 died during the war, so that's about 5% of the population, which would equal about 3 million people today based on our current population. Okay, I just talked about Lord Dunmore and his proclamation trying to get slaves to run away and join the British. So as a result of that, African Americans were then allowed to enlist for the colonists, for the American side. Okay, so as a result of that, we have about 5,000 people who enlisted in state militias, the Continental Army, and the Navy. Let's see, people were drafted into the militia, like I said, unless you could get a substitute. And many slaves would go on to win their freedom this way by serving in place of an owner or an owner's son. All right. Okay, Rhode Island. In 1778, they formed an African American regiment. So in other areas, we're looking at integrated units, okay? Like I said, whoever can fight, people are getting together and doing that. What happens in Rhode Island in creating this unit that is entirely consisting of African American men, that will form a pattern. And essentially from this point on, any war, well, once we get into the United States existing, any war that the United States gets into, until we get to the Korean War in the 1950s, all units will be segregated, okay? So this is kind of the last time that we see different cultural groups fighting together for a common aim. Okay, but so, Rhode Island, 1778, they formed an African American regiment. They promised freedom to these men who fought, because these were enslaved men. And they also compensated owners for their loss of labor so that there would not be an uprising on that front as well, okay? Okay, and then this last point hits on what I was just saying. African Americans who served in our state militias during this time did so in integrated companies. And like I said, this would be the last time we see this until we get to the 1950s, all right? Okay, so except for South Carolina and Georgia, which South Carolina and Georgia always like to go against the grain, but except for them, all colonies recruited African Americans to fight in the war. And in the southern colonies, these men, after the fact, were not honored for their service, but many would be individually honored, just not nationally. Okay, so some received individual recognition. Okay, Americans suffered numerous defeats in the first years of the war. Like I said, everything was stacked against them. But they generally avoided direct confrontations while managing to keep their army intact, right? So, let's see. After repeated losses, American morale was pretty low. So this is still in the first year of the war, okay? American morale is low. A lot of soldiers just return home. They just go AWOL and leave. And the army, which had started out, quickly builds to 28,000 people and then drops to 3,000 people. So 25,000 people decided that this wasn't working. What's the point? I'm going home. Okay. And then there's a shift in this morale that we're talking about, all right? So the battles of New Jersey occur. This is a surprise attack on the Hessians, the Germans, who were in Trenton, New Jersey. This is the day after Christmas, okay, so December 26th, 1776. And then this goes through to January of 1777. So this is just the winter, those winter months right then. This surprise attack was able to occur because at this point in time, battles weren't fought during the winter. Armies would go and have their winter quarters, and then whenever things warmed up, they would get back to killing each other, okay? But so it was kind of assumed that there wouldn't be any fighting going on. This is when Washington crosses the Delaware. I know we've all seen that image. So the reason that picture itself is so iconic is because, yes, this is the shift in the Revolution when the Americans felt like, okay, maybe we can do this, which we know that it works out in the end. But so the image of Washington crossing the Delaware represents that pivot in the war, okay? Okay, so like I said, this is our shift. Things start looking up for the Americans. And this takes us into our next year, so 1777. A second British army, which was led by John Burgoyne, had advanced from Canada, so they're moving south, and they were hoping to link up with troops that were coming from New York, okay, and then surround the colonists in Massachusetts, basically, all right? Well, just to isolate New England, I should say. All right, July that year, General Howe, William Howe, who's the guy coming from New York that was hoping to meet up, Howe moved his troops to Philadelphia for an attack on the Continental Congress. But knowing that this was going to happen, the Continental Congress flees and they go to Lancaster, Pennsylvania, so central Pennsylvania. So they're ahead of that campaign to overrun them. And General Howe, not knowing about Burgoyne's plans to come down south, essentially abandoned him. All right. So the Americans are able to block Burgoyne from moving any further south, and they end up surrounding Burgoyne's troops. So this is the Battle of Saratoga, and this happens on October 17th, 1777, and leads to a British surrender. All right. Again, boost in morale, and so with that, this then inspires the French to then start supporting the American goal for independence. All right. Okay. We're now in 1778. American diplomats who are led by Benjamin Franklin. Remember, Benjamin Franklin is the most popular American during this time. They draft what is called the Treaty of Amity and Commerce. And France officially recognized the United States as its own entity and agreed to supply military assistance. Okay. This is, so French support played a decisive part in the war's end. Basically, whenever they get French support, that things really start to shift and an American victory can actually be seen, okay, down that dark tunnel, okay? All right, so the French fleet showed more interest in attacking British outposts in the West Indies. Piracy is still going on. They're more concerned with that than in directly helping the Americans. Spain also joins on the American side. Pretty much anything to, just against the British is what it comes down to. So Spain also joins the Americans. And with this turns into a world war, basically, all right? A global conflict, if you will. So it's America, France, Spain versus Britain, all right? Okay. So let's look at what's going on in the South. As the war goes on, the focus really moves from New England further south, which will bring us to Georgia. All right, so December 1778, British forces occupied Savannah. May 1780, the British captured Charleston, South Carolina. And with that, American troops of about 5,000 people. So this was a significant victory in the South for the British at this time. So this was considered the lowest part of the war. So, early on, the Americans feel like they're not going to be able to do this, start getting victories, start getting French and Spanish support, things are looking good, and then all of this starts happening in the South, and morale starts to decline a little bit again. Okay, so this is the lowest point in the war. Congress is bankrupt, all right, even though they have support from these other nations. Thousands ended up defecting and joining the British side, just, a whole slew of reasons, fear, necessity, whatever. But so thousands end up joining the British side, which gives them this resurgence in power. In the city of Savannah alone, 14 regiments defected to the British side. That's just one city, okay? And then going back to Lord Dunmore's proclamation and this promise of freedom for enslaved individuals in the South. So tens of thousands of slaves ended up seeking freedom by retreating to the British side. So that was kind of looking like that might be the push that the British needed to get control again. But they're kind of unable to consolidate their power on the South because it's so scattered. Excuse me. And then in South Carolina and Georgia, civil wars break out in themselves. So, there are those who support the Americans versus those who support the British. So there's this larger war, and then there are smaller micro wars happening also. Okay. All right, this brings us up to 1781. Okay, so American victories at Cowpens in South Carolina, and then the Guilford Courthouse, particularly the Guilford Courthouse in North Carolina, really solidify that American victory. British forces end up retreating in Virginia. So this is near the Chesapeake Bay. French and American forces blocked okay, I'll start over, sorry. French and American forces blocked a British escape in Virginia. They also prevented any new supplies from coming in. So the British, they're blocked at this point, all right? Running out of provisions, food, weaponry, okay? And then the Battle of Yorktown transpires. So this is October 19th. And after that, General Cornwallis ended up surrendering 8,000 of his troops, okay, British commander. So this effectively ends the American Revolution. And the Treaty of Paris is signed September of 1783. So a couple years down the line. But British and America, this was a British and American negotiation. The Americans won their recognition of independence, and then they also granted amnesty or forgiveness to any loyalists that had remained in America after the war. So anybody who had remained loyal to the British Crown and fought for them, but then stayed in America, they were given forgiveness and not punished for their actions. I actually just learned this last week, looking at my own family genealogy, that I had an ancestor that was under Cornwallis in Tennessee, or who later went to Tennessee, I should say. Anyway, has nothing to do with our class, just something I learned. Okay, so that is where this chapter ends. And we are now looking at these United States. And that will send us into chapter 6, which is about early nationhood. So our childhood years as a nation. Okay? All right, that's all I've got for right now. If you guys have any questions, let me know. We will go over this in our next class meeting. So that's all I got for you. All right, I hope you guys have an awesome day, and I will talk to you soon. All right, bye.